I think overall, it's just been really interesting over the last, I guess, month or two, especially after the demonstrations and the protests and all. And I've been sort of waiting to see where all of this goes. I guess I'm a bit of a veteran, so to speak, and we've sort of been through this before, and there's usually a lot of commotion, and then after some time, we find ourselves pretty much back in the place we were before the incident that caused the commotions in the first place. So I am hopeful, though, that this will be at least a beginning, and I think one of the problems is that we need to have more dialogue around what is the problem. Because just to say, let's end racial discrimination, to me, doesn't really take us a lot closer to doing anything, just because we don't have a real grounding of what that looks like, just because of the nature of the problem. So hopefully we'll have some of those discussions, maybe even tonight, about what does this really mean. But I think as far as my perspective, as far as what's going on in our schools and what our young people need, they need to be better connected, I think, overall with community and hopefully with caring adults. And I think for a lot of our kids, they go to school and they don't believe there's anyone at their schools that really care about them. And so if they're coming from a home where they may be not getting what they need as far as direction, or possibly there's some kind of trauma that they're carrying, if they don't have someone at school to support them, they are probably not going to be very productive. And for a lot of the kids that we've been talking about, they have a history of not being productive in school. So if we are not much more intentional in connecting with them and creating meaningful relationships with adults in the school, I think the issues are going to continue. And when they are not addressed, then you get things like suspensions and expulsions and things like that. So that's basically my thinking as far as what we need to do. We need to sort of come up with some kind of a structure in our schools where more of our kids can have those meaningful relationships.
All right, thank you. So that you kind of touched upon my next thing, but maybe you could dive into a little more. What do you wish the general population knew about today's youth and the impact of living San Jose plays into the school to prison pipeline? You touched a little bit on it with trauma, you know.
Yeah, and I think as far as what I wish they knew is I wish they knew that we as adults are doing a poor job in raising our kids. And so I think we need to be much more responsible and recognize the fact that we're living in a society that actually works against creating those relationships that I mentioned before. David Brooks had an interesting article in The Atlantic a little while ago, and he was basically lamenting the failure of the nuclear family. And I think overall, basically, what he was saying is that given the structure of our communities and our families, they are not supportive enough to support the emotional needs of our kids as they are maturing. And the result is what we see in our schools and on our streets and in our juvenile halls. And so I think the public needs to be much more aware that we are not doing a good job in raising our kids. And so I'm not sure how you create that sense of urgency, because it does need to be a sense of urgency. I don't think this is something that you can take casually. And so creating that sense of urgency, at least on a community level, and it may need to be community by community, is what we need to really focus on. And I think the other thing too I would add is that I think we need to be much more cognizant of the fact that our kids need to have us understand that we want to hear their voices. I think they feel pretty much ignored in a lot of ways. The structure in our schools easily allows a kid to be ignored. There are a few kids who get a lot of attention, and then there's a lot of kids who don't get any attention at all. And so we need to figure out how do we make sure that our kids feel like their voices are valuable, that we want to hear from them, and we can have that kind of intercourse with them where we can give them our feedback to let them know we are hearing them. And so that would be the other thing I would hope that we can do a better job of moving forward.
I've heard this from the youth too, and I think part of the frustration is the feeling that only certain youth get heard, right? Not all the voices get heard. That those that
I think that's true. I think particularly if you are brown or black, at most schools, you will see that it's always interesting to me to go to the schools, and what they will do at some of the campuses, they will put up the valedictorians or other kids who are serving in some meaningful capacity at the schools. And unfortunately, too few of those kids are brown and black. And so there's a lot of these subtle messages that our kids get that their voices really don't matter, and it's those others who really are the ones who count. And I think we just need to figure out how do we come up with a way to make sure that their voices are heard too, so they also feel valued.
Yeah. I think that's a good question, is how do we give them a voice?
Mm-hmm.
So this issue has been talked about for multiple years. Have you seen changes implemented that have started to turn the tide? You kind of commented that, you know, after events like we've seen recently, that there's a lot of messaging, a lot of push, but then when things settle down, you feel like there hasn't been much change. But have you, if you look back retrospectively, have you seen some steps in the right direction and some changes result from that?
Not a whole lot. I think it's very difficult if you're talking about the school system to come up with those, to make those changes. There's such a bureaucracy there that to do anything meaningfully different, it's hard to do. So I'm thinking if I could put my finger on something that I can say that particular thing really made a difference. But for instance, there was a push for a while. Matter of fact, one of the things I'm doing is working over at Overfelt High School in San Jose. And a few years ago, they had this effort where they looked at where in the county did they have the most juvenile arrests. And it was in the Overfelt district. It was 95122. And so there was an interagency push to change that statistic where there were more arrests there than any other place. And the thing that concerns me sometimes is we get sort of pushed by these numbers to do things, and we change the numbers, but it doesn't mean there's anything materially different that's happening. So you can change the number of suspensions that you have. What you do is you just divert them into some other program that basically allows you to not to suspend them, but you really haven't changed the dynamic for that kid as far as them being successful at school or any place else. And so it may allow us to say, yes, the numbers have changed, but in effect, though, we really have not changed the trajectory of those kids. And we need to come up with something much more meaningful as far as what we're doing to change the attitudes of our young people.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the data because it seemed, you know, I was hearing a lot of focus on the males, and then we saw the numbers for females go up in the juvenile system. So I thought, you know, maybe if we're being channeled by the data, you're right. We should not just be channeled by the data, but we should have a more universal look at the issues that are underlining that data and look at those issues first. I appreciate that. Let's see, in the comments, Roxanna added one of the critiques of arrest data as well is that it's a function of police behavior, engaging in arrests, not necessarily of youth, engaging in misbehavior, but no, some areas are more heavily policed than others. I imagine that's so.
I agree. They had an interesting documentary on Netflix. I don't even remember the name of it, but there was a Caucasian lady who she was talking about white privilege. And she talked about her life and growing up. And when she was younger, she had a bit of a troubled time during high school. And she had this boyfriend who was African American. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about the stories, how they would get stopped. And there was drugs in the car. But he would get arrested, but they would let her go. And it happened more than once. And so she was highlighting how in many instances that the response of those in authority, the police, is completely different depending on the color of the skin of whoever they are confronting. And so that is still a problem. What is prosecuted or why people are arrested on the west side is different than on the east side. And so we need to raise the sensitivity to those kinds of issues and have some conversation with those who are policing our communities about those kinds of issues. And so, yes, that continues to be a problem as far as discriminating as far as police respond.
Well, whether they're in school or out of school, right? Even administrators sometimes inside the school have the same tendencies of bias. And we see this with restraint and seclusion, unfortunately. And I'm grateful that legislation has changed, but changing legislation might not change the issue.
I think it was stated by the mayor of Minneapolis talking about changing the policies of the police department, and what he said in his statement is what you have to do is change the culture, because culture will always trump policy. And so we have to figure out how do we change the culture to a degree that we have the same expectations and we have the same responses to our young people, no matter what their ethnicity is or the color of their skin.
Yeah. So Warren wanted to add it anecdotally. He's heard that white kids caught for drug offenses will get offered. I think he probably wanted to say release or something a lower. Whereas a black or brown person will be arrested, and that parallels the story you shared. Roxanna adds.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, sadly, right? Mm-hmm. Roxanna added, this is the problem with predictive analytics. Big data are used to do the predictions, and they perpetuate the cycle of arrests in communities that are heavily policed already. She provided an excellent article to refer to there in the chat. And so Warren clarified that a Caucasian person will be offered rehab, and then someone of color will be offered arrest, which sadly is what we're hearing too often. Okay, so can we talk a little bit about the zero tolerance policies and school resource officers that have been highlighted so much lately? What have you noticed school districts doing to mitigate the effects of the zero tolerance policies and the SROs? And will the public calling for the removal of SROs be enough?
I don't know. You may have some other folks on the call who can speak more specifically about the zero tolerance policy. I know that it seems to be less of an issue these days. I encountered it a few times when it was, I was on the county board of education, and a lot of times those kids would be expelled, and the way it usually worked is that the kids who went to maybe the schools on the west side, they were there with their parents, sometimes even with a lawyer, to argue their case. Whereas if there was a kid maybe from the east side, they would just get expelled, even though the circumstances may have been similar. So I think there is less these days of a urge for districts to use zero tolerance. That doesn't mean that they don't have other means to address a kid's issues. But I think using that as much as maybe even a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, I get the sense that maybe districts aren't using that quite as much as before, but I think they have they've become more sensitive given the publicity that that issue has generated. As far as the police on campus, it'll be interesting to see what happens now. I think there needs to be some resource on campus. Personally, I think if there's a uniformed person, I think that creates a bit of tension, particularly for our community. And so I think we do need resources on campus, but they don't need to be there to arrest. But if they are there to play a role on campus and connect with kids, I think we definitely could benefit from having that kind of a resource on our campus. And hopefully, with a lot of the attention that has generated here lately, hopefully we'll have more of those resources that will be much more helpful to make sure that our kids stay in school and they don't go a route of being arrested.
Roxanna, you wanted to add to that?
Yes, thank you so much. Let me get my camera on back up. Hi, everyone. So I'll introduce myself really briefly for folks who may not know. So I'm Roxanna Marche. I am education chair for the California NAACP and have also served as education chair for San Jose Silicon Valley NAACP, and I'm a professor at Jose State University in the College of Education. I teach educational psychology and leadership in our doctoral program. So a lot of my research has focused on climate violence prevention in schools. And really when the zero tolerance policies started to ramp up right after Columbine, it was a response that school administrators often took to try to show that they had a safe school. And so it was a very harsh punitive approaches of suspending or expelling students for misbehavior. The zero tolerance part of it has to do with if it's there are 5 offenses that are basically grounds for expulsion, and it's brandishing a knife, having a gun on campus. I think there's school fight. It's assault. You know, like if there's an actual like physical harm, and I'm so sorry, I'm blanking out on the other 2, but those are the severe ones. And then there's a gray area where it's called willful defiance. And so what we were seeing was a lot of suspensions for low-level type misbehaviors, where the students were being suspended from campus for days at a time. And that lost time is really harmful, and it was leading to a lot more students of color in going into the prison system. So this was the justice system. So it was contributing to the school to prison pipeline. In 2012, there was legislation that was passed in California to try to eliminate this willful defiance category. And so it was a last resort. Suspensions or exclusionary discipline was a last resort. The schools had to demonstrate evidence that they had attempted in several different kind of more restorative and supportive ways to guide the students' behavior. And so we saw a dramatic decrease in suspensions, and it's exactly what Leon was talking about, that sometimes the decrease in numbers doesn't necessarily mean that the students are actually included and kept within the classroom. Locally, there's a lot that's happening where districts are engaging in efforts to address this issue. I see Superintendent Chris Funk on the call at Eastside Union High School District, and they've been engaged in this work for years now. It sounds like someone just unmuted themselves. And so maybe that person wants to chime in and I can stop talking. But I just, there's a lot of organizations right now in partnership with the school districts trying to address this issue. The Office of Cultural, sounds like there's someone talking. I'm not sure if this is, yeah.
Oh, the back
is that Reverend Moore?
No, what you hear in the back of the webcam.
It's background. It looks like it's Edward Moore is still talking right now. That's fine. So I'll just try to keep going. But what I wanted to say was that there are many local efforts, thank you, to address this issue. And there have been focused, I don't know, interventions or attempts to work with the schools. Leon Beauchman just mentioned at Overfelt some of the work that they had done. We've worked with the Office of Cultural Competency and the Burns Institute at Overfelt and at Mount Pleasant High School in Eastside Union, and have worked with the district as a whole as well to shift the climate to be inclusive, more welcoming, addressing, a lot of those sort of connection and relationship issues to strengthen that school climate as one of the ways to reduce the exclusionary discipline. One of the other areas is also ethnic studies, like changing the curriculum to be more relevant and engaging for youth where they see themselves in the curriculum. Mm-hmm. That's another, that's some efforts that I know that in Elm Rock and at San Jose Unified, there's some champions of social justice within those communities that are also engaging in that work. I have a ton to share, so I'll stop for now, but I'll chime in again. And if it's okay, I'll continue to post some of the policy documents that are relevant. National Education Policy Center just did a report where they looked at what works and what doesn't work with restorative justice and restorative approaches in schools. Some of the misimplementation, practices are if it's a top-down policy, doesn't work very well. And then there's also another one on looking at it's a double-edged sword of restorative justice. I'll put that article as well. Thanks.
I think you and I talked briefly about that if it's being forced on the students, there's less of an impact than the students being invited to engage at will. Yeah. Tiffany added for
exactly, and it also can and it also can stigmatize students who it can depending on the way the narratives go. If it's, oh, I have restorative justice now, I have to go to this thing, and it's not something that's seen as useful, but it's seen as a punishment, then it backfires.
Right.
Sorry, you were about to say something about.
No, I was just gonna. Tiffany had shared that for over 80 years, social scientists have known that poor language skills are closely associated with the constellation of emotional and behavioral disturbances routinely seen in juvenile and criminal court. Fully agree. These include conduct disorder, academic deficits, social incompetence, impulsivity, and even aggression. As we might expect, researchers have also found that language impairments are present at a high rate with juvenile and adult correctional institutions. So far, however, the law has barely acknowledged even the existence of this body of social science, let alone its significance for the administration of justice, rehabilitation, and public safety. And then Rebecca was adding to your list of what those 5 were. Sexual harassment was one that I think you were thinking about, Roxanna. So, and
yes, that was it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was, so we've touched on this a little bit, but can we dive into some other policies and systems that have bias that we need to change to really, you talked about needing a cultural shift, but and maybe that's the answer to what I'm asking you, but are there other policies or systems that have bias that we need to see changed to work on this issue?
Well, I think you can just sort of go through the various elements that are in the system, and in some way, shape, or form, they do need some shifting as far as how they are addressing a lot of the issues that they see every day. I mean, starting even with the teachers. What we know, particularly, let's say if you're an African American, you can go through your whole education program here from K to 12, and you may not have an African American teacher that you will see, or administrator. Certainly having somebody on campus, and there's some research to back this up, having other African American people in authority, teachers, administrators on campus is a help. To just have somebody there who looks like you that you can relate to. And we know that a lot of our teachers, they have not necessarily had a whole lot of exposure to issues related to implicit bias and things like that. And so it happens. I think way too often. In a lot of cases, I know a lot of teachers don't know quite what to do just because they are not familiar with the situation. But unfortunately, our kids, they suffer because of that. And so certainly we need to do a lot more work addressing the issue of bias and just basic expectations as far as what the attitudes of the kids who our teachers are working with. So I think that is a huge problem. I think the other thing is that just the structure of the school doesn't lend itself to creating meaningful relationships, particularly when you get to the middle school and the high school level. And kids are just sort of getting processed. And so this is something that has been going on for a long time, and unfortunately, the kids that we're getting today, they are having more and more of a difficult time just being part of this system. And so in a lot of cases, they need smaller schools, smaller classrooms, more individualized effort towards them. Some of you may remember John Vasconcellos, who passed away, I guess, about 5 or 6 years ago. When he was in the state senate, I believe it was, he went before the legislature. Matter of fact, he introduced legislation that would have demanded that each child have an individual education program, an IEP. And so that didn't get very far. I think the teachers union was one of the entities that worked against that legislation because it would have significantly changed everything that goes on in schools every day. And so, but that is the kind of structure I think that is suggested if we want to deal with the needs of a lot of our kids. Some of our kids are doing fine, but there's a significant number that are not. And so the question becomes, do we keep doing what we're doing and be satisfied with the system doing a okay job with a percentage of our kids, or do we recognize that too many of the kids are not getting what they need, and we're having to deal with it later on when it comes to the juvenile justice system or the welfare system and other systems. So I think those two aspects of our education system needs to be addressed, among other things.
That's great. Tiffany added, the numbers are even worse for students of color with disabilities. Over a quarter of African American boys with disabilities and 14% of African American girls with disabilities receive at least one out-of-school suspension in 2011-2012. African American students with disabilities represent 18.7% of the special education population. Not in my district. I wish it was that high. But 49.9% of special education, and I think that was the 49.9% of special education, the justice system. Tanya Jace shared a book, We Want to Do More Than Survive Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. And then Roxanna added that yes to that book. This is a thought-provoking read on the way that
Restorative Justice.
RJ stands for Restorative Justice, and it's also called Restorative Practices sometimes in schools.
I didn't know what RP was.
Yeah.
Okay.
RP.
Get implemented. It's not a plug and play intervention. Very true. It needs to be done in nuanced and thoughtful ways, which is, you know, certainly something we should be talking about in debate here, because the nuance is significant. Let's see that. So this issue is complex and needs many changes. Leon, where would you start and why? With the parenting, or?
Well, I think if we could do anything, we probably need a totally new classification of people on campus, educators, counselors, or whatever. Because as I was saying before, first of all, structurally, we're not set up to deal with a lot of the issues that are walking in the door each day. And I'm not sure if many of you have heard of the ACEs study. It's adverse childhood experiences. It was done by Kaiser a number of years ago. Mm-hmm. And what they identified was 10 different factors that happened in a child's life, could happen in a child's life, that were traumatic, that the more you had of these, the less likely you were going to be healthy and you were going to die earlier. And we see a lot of these walking in the door every day, and some of these could have to do with domestic violence, whether somebody is a drug user at the house. There were 10 of them in total. And so we need to have a better idea of what our kids are dealing with if we're really going to serve them. And so we need people in our schools who can deal with those. And I just don't think the way we're structured, teachers can be the people who do that. They're just not trained to do that. And if we are going to ask them to address the academic need of our kids, I don't know if we can also ask them to deal with the psychological needs of our kids. And so we need to have some people on our campuses, in our schools, who can make those connections with kids, be that comforting adult there if that's what's needed, or at least somebody there to identify where there's an issue. Because if we wait and it gets to the high school level, it just is triply difficult to enact or make changes at that particular point in time. And so if I was king, that would be what I would do to make sure that we would do what's necessary to make sure that all kids are healthy. At least that's where I would start anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't help but agree with every bit of what you said. And, you know, and I have looked at that ACEs report because it's surprising the impact of trauma on a child and the development of their brain and just their being. So, mm-hmm. and adults too. Yeah. Thank you.
You don't lose it. It stays with you. So, but especially when you're a child, it's even more devastating. So that's why I think we need to do more earlier, so we don't have to deal with the issue when they become adults.
Right, and as you said, it gets more costly, not just because of the loss with the young adult that hasn't been properly treated along the way, but just in that they're entering the juvenile system or the welfare system, and
right.
It's a vicious cycle. So Roxanna wanted to add this Know Your Rights resource from the ACLU. She's put the link in the chat there, so please look at it if you need and add it to your resources. It may also be of interest for folks. They've shared this out of the state NAACP conferences. Tanya added, we need community schools as a model, and shared a link to that so you can look at it. She also added, we need ethnic studies in pre-K through 12. I agree. They're just introducing ethnic studies in San Jose Unified High School, but I'd like to see it across the board. Tiffany added interdisciplinary team approach, equity-based, inclusive educational delivery model. Yes, Leon. Warren added that he liked the idea of ethnic studies in K through 12. Rebecca said, thank you for bringing up the ACEs study. Mr. Beauchman, I completely agree. We need to be more aware of a child's adverse childhood experiences. And Tiffany said,
go
ahead.
I just wanted to add something about, we're talking about, adding ethnic studies to the curriculum. And my concern is that, yeah, you can add a book or a chapter on ethnic studies, but who's going to teach it?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I mean, the person who's teaching it doesn't have any sensitivity to the subject, and you're going to teach it in the same old ways.
Yeah.
I think you are doing things that satisfy, I guess, the politics, but it's not meaningful. And so we not only need to deal with those, but we need to do it in a different way where kids are walking away with something that's truly meaningful. And as of right now, I'm not seeing anything that would suggest to me that we're going to be teaching ethnic studies in a way that's really going to help people appreciate some of the diversity that exists in our country.
Thank you. Yeah, it goes back to the nuances that were brought up before, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. Tiffany wanted to thank you for recognizing this. Oh, she wants us to recognize that school is often the source of trauma, which is actually sadly how Tiffany and I met, because our kids have been through a fair amount of trauma in their third grade experiences at their schools. So Roxanna added that oh, yes, Roxanna, go ahead.
So I'll add just a comment about the trauma-informed and the introduction of social emotional learning in schools, because it is really important. And I also just wanted to let folks know that we have a teacher, Tanya Jaco, who is a middle school teacher and who has been a champion across the state for advocating for ethnic studies in education. And she's also, sorry, I hope this is okay, Tanya, that I'm celebrating your work. I think that there's just a lot of, yeah, so, but also she's doing her doctoral work at San Jose State. But what I wanted to mention about trauma-informed and social emotional learning in schools, and this comes from my early research, so this is over 20 years of research on the evaluation of social emotional learning approaches in schools. And trauma-informed is really kind of the, it's the same type of approaches, being compassionate, like understanding what students have been through, understanding the psychology of, and impacts of trauma. It's more kind of from the medical model, but the approach is the same. It's to have more compassionate responses to youth who are struggling. I encourage everyone to differentiate the trauma-informed and social emotional learning, the authentic relational aspects of it within the schools that we want to, I'm a supporter of trauma-informed and social emotional learning in schools. We need to differentiate that from the attempts to try to measure it. Mm-hmm. The same ACEs, those adverse childhood experiences, because they are predictive. In that Kaiser study, they looked and they said, oh, look, if a child has 4 or 5 adverse childhood experiences, they are at a blank % higher likelihood of dying of heart disease, dying of cancer, like having some health issues later in life that has very serious, effects later in life. The way that data are being gathered right now in schools, there is not enough protection from those data getting actually merged into these big data sets that do end up into the predictive analytics, that could impact our current youth later in terms of getting health insurance, in terms of getting jobs and things like that. So it's just as a heads up, this is right now we're talking about racial inequities and racial racism in schools, structural racism. We have to address algorithmic racism and the way that data that we're gathering in schools could intentionally, we don't know that it's happening, but it's actually could be contributing to racial injustice and harm later down the line. So just differentiating between the authentic, real, relational, social emotional learning and trauma informed, super important. That does not mean measure it, rank it, try to rank kids by their, impulse control and things like that. That can be really labeling and damaging. And then the other thing I'll mention, I just want to invite Ani to comment about ethnic studies and teacher education and, the efforts that we're trying to make. Clearly there's a long way to go, but she's definitely one of the champions in this work in the teaching space. And so maybe I just wanted to offer,
Tonya, now that you've been put on the soapbox.
No worries. Thank you. I wasn't sure and I didn't want to interrupt, but I definitely would love to share. I am a middle school teacher in San Jose Unified. I teach at Hoover Middle School. I am also the NEA Board of Director representing one of 14 directors in California at the national level. I am the chair for the Civil Rights and Education on CTA State Council and the secretary for the NEA Black Caucus. And so, and then I'm also working on my doctorate at San Jose State, and my focus and my research is on the implementation of ethnic studies in K-12 schools here in California. And so I'm coming with that lens, or all of those lenses, but really focusing on racial justice in education. And so as it's mentioned, I'm sure I can give you all of the data, which I'm sure everyone here is probably well aware of, the disproportionate rates that Black and Brown students are disciplined and referred and suspended, the lack of representation in curriculum. We as educators make up 20% of the teaching profession, teachers of color. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color, we make up only 20% of the teaching profession on a national average. Here in California, there are approximately 305,000 educators throughout the state for public schools, CTA members. Out of that 305,000 members, about 12,000 of them are Black. And of the 305,000, 12,000 are Black, and of that, about 3,400 are Black men. So I'm saying all of that to say that as we're talking about the issues in education, we have to stop, and Dr. Bettina Love mentions this as well, is we have to stop trying to manage these inequities, and we really have to get at the root of this systemic issue that is creating the inequities in the first place. And when we're looking at the uprisings, we're looking at all of the data, and we're looking at things that are happening, we have to be reflective and see our role and ask, what is our role as educators and as leaders within our communities, but particularly in education, what is our role in this? And what I see time and time again is the lack of structure or space to even talk about race in our schools. And so if we are not providing, no other profession, no disrespect, but no other profession comes into existence without coming through educators. And if we as educators are not willing or able to provide a structure and a means to have these kind of critical conversations and to start thinking critically about the systems and the work that's around us, how in the world are we going to expect anyone else to? And so we have to go back and look at our own system and our own structure and see what we're doing and what we're not doing, and the ways in which we are pushing students of color out of school and into the criminal justice system, which is why I am a staunch advocate for absolutely no cops on campus. We need our students, our scholars, not suspects. We want counselors, not cops. And if we're looking at the infrastructure that's in place, our students don't need to be policed. They need counselors, they need psychological services, social workers, relevant programs, robust programs, a rigorous and robust ethnic studies curriculum. They need athletic programs, art programs. Those are the things that are going to build our students up and not tear them down. When it comes to ethnic studies, it can't just be, again, because what I see often is, or what I'm starting to see is that what schools and districts do is they do things with the name of ethnic studies, but it is not authentic to ethnic studies. And as it was mentioned, ethnic studies is not a book. It's not one book that you read. It is not one chapter. It's not one unit that you focus on. There are core values that go into the curriculum, and one of them is decentering whiteness. It is talking about pre-colonial. And it is one of the core values is thinking critically about the systems of inequities. This is not a diversity, this is not a multicultural curriculum, right? Multicultural says we want to acknowledge everyone and we want to give everyone the opportunity to be represented, but how are they represented? So multicultural studies is not ethnic studies. Because ethnic studies, if you get down to it and you're doing it with fidelity, it brings about civic engagement. And it's about, you're disrupting systems and advocating for systemic change. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing ethnic studies right. And so then there becomes there's a ripple effect, because now we have to look at who's qualified to teach ethnic studies. What are the teacher preparation programs that look like? What do they look like and what's required of them? Do they need to have an ethnic studies credential, right? You can't take 80% of the teaching profession that are white, that are a product of the system, right? Because we're a product of the system. There's a lot of things that teachers themselves, we need to unlearn. Right? Because if you're doing diversity and your idea of representation is still having your third graders dress up as pilgrims and Indians for a Thanksgiving Day parade, you're doing it wrong. If your only representation is Dr. King and Rosa Parks, who was this old Black woman who was just tired and didn't want to get up, if that's your representation of African American culture and history in the month of February only, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, can I ask you a quick question though? I mean, because you are part of the teacher union. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, given what you just said, are the teachers union doing anything to address this issue?
Absolutely, and so I'm sharing this and being transparent, right? That there's a lot of work to not only decolonize our school system, but we have to decolonize our corporations, our democratic process, and also our own unions and organizations, right? And so there is a fight even within our own union to push for racial justice. And we've come a long way, right? Where we're just now starting to prioritize racial justice, where we are starting to prioritize and training our members, training our leaders and our directors. Our CTA board recently went through Heather Hackman training to examine themselves and looking at, because a lot of times we look at diversity and it's about checking boxes, right? Check, oh, we have one more brown person, we're diverse, check. But you're not really creating space for diverse views and perspectives, right? And we're not looking at the ways in which, first of all, being able to identify what white supremacy looks like, right? What are the characteristics of white supremacy culture and all of the different ways in which we perpetuate it, even within our own organizations. And so we've done a lot of training around that to start to shift the culture, even within our own organization, to be able to start to push back on our local school districts and our school sites to be more inclusive and to bring this to the forefront and say, we can't avoid talking about this. And we have started to champion for ethnic studies and started to champion for racial justice training and talking about white supremacy culture. The NEA was a few years ago now, that passed a resolution identifying as that white supremacy culture is the route to institutionalized racism. Mm-hmm. And also aiding in the school to prison pipeline. And we need to start talking about white fragility and the reason why we can't have these kind of conversations in order to create real systemic change. So to answer your question, there is a move and a push to do that, but also want to be transparent in a way and aware that the same time that we're fighting systemic racism in schools, we're doing that in every organization across the board, including the teachers.
Well, I mentioned that because, I mean, changing that mindset among those folks who are working in the field is huge, because as we all know, that they don't, most teachers do not have the background to do that. And so how do you convince teachers that this is a worthy thing, that they need to basically change the way that they think? That's going to be fundamental if we're going to have an ethnic studies program that's going to be effective. What I would suggest is that we need to take a look at the structure of our schools, such that maybe we come to the realization, maybe we need people who are not on campus, who come onto campus to help teach those subjects. And then we are able to utilize people who are much more intimately involved day in and day out with the whole issue of a liberation psychology, so to speak, to have them do that. And to me, that would be a much more effective way to go than to expect that over time, that somehow teachers are going to get this and they're going to be able to teach it.
Well, I can tell you as a Black teacher, every single day in the classroom is an act of resistance. Every single day in the classroom, right? So if you consider that I'm bringing that to my students and the ways in which structurally I'm not permitted to take that to a larger audience, right? I'm not the only one though. There are teachers who teach ethnic studies every single day and they don't get credit for it. Why? Because we have to do it without people knowing it, per se, right? And when I say without people knowing it, that doesn't mean that their principals don't know it. It's just that the district doesn't recognize their class as an ethnic studies class. And so what I'm saying, or what I would say, is that what we need to do is tap into the educators that are already on the ground doing this work every single day and provide them a space to share with others. And that comes with, and so one of the things that I did is I had a meeting just last week with someone from our district, because San Jose Unified just passed a resolution on making Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And that comes with some action. And so now we're having conversations. The district is now opening up and listening. And we pulled a team of Black teachers together to say, this is what you need to start doing. Here are the things we need to start doing on an ongoing basis, which includes racial justice training starting at the district level. But we also are demanding that racial justice training be provided on an ongoing basis and be required for all educators.
Okay, well, I'll be interested to see where that goes. I would love to get a list of those teachers who are already involved with this. But the thing I would suggest, given this point in our history as a nation and everything that we've seen over the last several months, I think we would be negligent not to take advantage of what's going on in our streets, in our media, to help our kids get a better understanding of what's going on in the world, and to get them involved in some kind of way of looking at this, expressing their feelings about this. I just think it's a huge opportunity, and I would love to work with a group of educators to help move forward in making these kinds of programs much more available in our local school districts.
Absolutely, and I'd be happy to partner with you as well, because like I said, there are quite a few educators throughout the state and across the nation even, but specifically here in San Jose that are doing this work every single day. It's just not, it's not in the spotlight per se.
Yeah. If I can just take a second, you probably, well, let me just say that the Santa Clara County Alliance of Black Educators, we put on a program each year to recognize kids who are graduating from elementary, middle, and high school. And as part of that program, we recognize adults in the community who are making significant contribution in helping our kids. And you were recognized this past year, even though we did not have the event because of the cancellation because of COVID, but you were one of the ones who were nominated, and we decided to award. So it's nice to meet you today, even though we didn't get a chance to meet you at our ceremony.
And
thank
that's
you so much. Yeah, I was gonna say that. I was like, and I got to get an award, so thank you so much.
So great. Oh, my worlds are colliding. I love this.
you know, there are two things you brought up, and one is that there are teachers that are doing some really good work that we will never hear about. And that pains me because there are a lot of amazing resources in the teaching staff that I feel gets untapped. So how do we open up the conversation to free teachers to say, I'm doing this and it's engaging my, I'm seeing this effect with my students. Let's grow this. Do you have the opportunity in a district to do that? Or do you feel like there's just not a opportunity?
So it really depends on, first of all, the school site. So I feel very fortunate that I have admins on my campus that support this work, that encourage it. And, but they also it could be just the opposite, right? Where they could start to micromanage me and start to do a lot of things to aggravate or make it difficult for me in my role. So I think that's one. The second thing is there are some structural things, with the district as far as, and I'm not blaming the district specifically, right? But just saying what the district decides to focus on and prioritize, right? And one of the things that I shared, and I think that's really important, is we look at the data and we see where's our largest opportunity, right? So some of even if you look at our discipline, and because of just our demographics, Latino males, right, are a focus, and they should be. But we also have to consider what other focuses are there, right? Black students, just on an average, make up 15% of the population, but they make up 34% of the population that is arrested in schools. So we're not sending students to the principal's office. We're sending them literally from our classrooms to the criminal justice system. We have to look at, and then even further, we still tend to focus on men. We tend to focus on boys, but what about our Black girls, right? So on average, Black girls make up about 14% of the population, but they make up 35% of the students who are suspended without access to any educational resources, right? And so, and I'm giving you like the national averages and numbers, but those are the disproportionate rates in which we kind of start to focus on one, but it's still, even with that, it still puts the student in the position of coming from a place of deficit, as if there's something wrong with that student, instead of looking at the system itself and what is creating the inequities. Because we don't have an achievement gap. We have an opportunity gap. It's not the same playing field. We're not playing anywhere near the same playing field. And you can look at that at how schools are funded based on their demographics.
Yes.
So when we're looking at that, we have to consider all of those things. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure if that is, and it's not apparent to me that is that's the universal mindset for all of our leadership in the district office, in the county office, in the city office, all of these offices, because people we train people to look at the data, see where the margin of error is, to see where the problem is, and try to find a solution for that problem instead of looking at the whole system as a whole.
Right.
Well, then I appreciate your comments there. The numbers in Santa Clara County are such that, the kids in the school is of African American descent is only 2 or 3% total. And so our challenge a lot of times is remaining visible. It's easy to sort of overlook African American kids because the percentages are not what some people call substantial. But when you look at a lot of the things that affect the climate of the school, whether it's the suspensions and expulsions, as you would suggest and the national numbers confirm, we are overrepresented. And so I think one of the challenges that we have here as a community, particularly as far as African American kids are concerned, is to make sure that we keep them visible and their needs visible. And a lot of times we have districts who prepare their LCAP report, and they will have hardly anything in that LCAP report as it relates to African American students, and it's mainly because they figure the numbers are not substantial. So I think it's up to us as a community to make sure that if that happens, they know that somebody is there watching and will be questioning what are they doing to support our kids. And so that is the challenge, I think, for the African American community in Santa Clara County.
Yeah, because the dashboard, if it's 11 or less, they don't even note it, right? So then you're just, and so
They're not there.
Yeah, but they are, right? They are. Okay, there's been a lot of, this has been a great discussion. I just want to make sure that everyone that was putting comments in the chat are heard. See, Tiffany asked if someone could speak about the intersection of ableism and racism, and she added a little bit further down in the chat that objects of protection, enduring notes of difference, disability intersections with quote and unquote other differences. 1916 to 2016, Alfredo J. Artiles, Sharman Dorn. I'm wondering if you're typed. Okay, Arizona State University. So she has a few references there, and dismantle ableism and stop our current two separate and segregated system of education in California. I don't think that's serving anyone to have the separated system to begin with. Do anyone want to comment on the intersectionality of ableism and?
I'd like to hear somebody speak about what they are thinking there. Yeah.
All right, Tiffany, you're put on the soapbox. If you can unmute yourself there.
Hi, this is Tiffany. So I wasn't expecting to speak, but what I'm talking about when I talk about the intersection of racism and ableism is going back historically and how the system of special education emerged in the United States. And around the same time, so as Brown v. Board of Education came about and talked about desegregation, this was also around the time that the idea of deinstitutionalizing children with disabilities came about. And side by side in our country, you saw this sort of othering and using disability and lack of intellectual capacity, all these other things sort of intertwined to oppress people that were seen as less than. So a lot of the same laws, discriminatory laws that applied to African Americans and other people of color and people who were seen as disabled, they sort of emerged side by side. And there's a lot of research around this in the critical disability theory studies and looking at the social and cultural correlations between disability or ableism and racism and how they sort of intersect to perpetuate each other. And you see it in special education, at least according to this body of research, a body of research that I agree with a lot. So I always want to take the opportunity to say, when we talk about intersections and we talk about bringing different lenses, this is a voice that doesn't always get heard in Santa Clara County. And even though we can say, oh, kids in juvenile hall are an average of 7 years behind academically. And we talk about data side by side without actually intersecting it and looking at, why did it develop this way? Why do we still continue to have two separate systems, even though all the research shows that this is not academically effective or fiscally efficient? So I just wonder, we have so many educators here and so many people with so much experience in California. I really don't understand why this two separate system continues, and why we don't like to talk about racism in the context of ableism, or it doesn't seem like we do.
Well, at least in my opinion, I think that perspective is sort of a product of the system overall. Even if the kid a lot of times is not special ed and they're able to get by, we recognize some kids more than other kids. If you have a certain set of skills, you will get a whole lot of attention. And you have some other kids who don't perform in the way that is recognized, and they will get very little attention. And that's why I mentioned before this, every kid should have an IEP, an individual education program, because if they did have one, if everyone had one, then those kids, everyone's special talents would be recognized and developed and appreciated. But right now we have this approach where we have a criteria, and a lot of it has to do with the standardization of education that we have. And if you are able to perform, you are rewarded. But if you aren't able to perform, you somehow are discarded. And so I think what you're saying is fundamentally true. And so we need to create a greater awareness, in my opinion, that all of our kids need to be celebrated. Whatever their skill levels are, in whatever ways that we think they should be, we should try to figure out how can we teach each of those kids to realize the potential that they have. And in that way, all kids benefit, not just Black kids, just not brown kids, but all kids benefit. And so that's one of the things I think we just have to keep letting folks know. The system isn't working not only for Black or brown kids, it's not working for a lot of white kids too. And so we need to make sure that people appreciate where we need to go to make the system what it could be.
And there's
I could add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just that I really appreciate that you brought up the standardization and the testing being contributing to this culture of hyper reliance on this, performance metrics at the outcome of the test scores. And one of the ways that's problematic is that it puts the blame on the kids, and it says, oh, you need to try harder, and if you didn't, you just tried harder. And that's where a lot of the pushback right now is coming around social emotional learning and the grit narrative, saying, oh, the student doesn't have enough grit, they need to have more grit. And actually the kids who are struggling have way more grit than anyone. They're resilient in so many ways, but they're being labeled as not trying hard enough. And so one of the ways that we're addressing this to highlight how problematic the culture is of the high stakes standardized testing is to recognize the extent to which students are absolutely trying. There's no lack of effort involved. Mm-hmm. And so there's a piece I'll put in the chat, counter narratives. And so this is, researchers who have looked, and this is to address Tiffany's question as well. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for the excellent recommendations that you've made as well. And attention to the ableism and the intersections with race. And so the piece that I'll put in the chat is addressing that intersection specifically, with also kind of this questioning this narrative, like pushing back against the master narrative of the kids just aren't trying hard enough, kind of a thing, which is ridiculous. So anyway, I'll post that, and it's related, so I thought I'd mention it. And it's also relevant for the current standardized tests as well.
Thank you. Lena and Tiffany touched actually all of you kind of touched on something of kids not being recognized unless they're achieving a certain way, but kids are also the younger kids who are hitting that wall of I'm trying and not succeeding. We see behaviors, and then they get a new kind of attention. And you know, I mean, when my son said, oh my God, they think I'm a monster, it was, yeah, that was the label that he felt he owned because of the way he was treated at school. And we don't want kids to ever think that they're monsters, that they're trying to communicate. And we need to have, as you said, staff that are trained and able to see that as a way of communication and not a way of being defiant. So I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm sorry to get off that tangent there, but Warren wanted to add to the ACEs talk that from a path appears with 4 more ACEs, the risk of hepatitis or jaundice increases 230%, depression 460%, and suicide 1,220%. And that's from First ACEs study in 1998. You know, someone privately was asking me, you know, what about with ethnic studies? Maybe we should be sharing some of that studies with the parents. You know, if we're educating kids, shouldn't we be educating the parents? Do you think there's an opportunity in that?
Definitely. One of the things we're talking to districts about right now is working to create a parent engagement network, so to speak, particularly for African American parents. And maybe out of this pandemic, we can create something that is a network so that we can communicate, particularly as African Americans and educators. We can communicate to these parents to say, here are some things you need to be aware of. Here are some things that you need to possibly consider as far as making sure that your kid is getting everything that they deserve. And so, yeah, I think that is important. It is a tough one, though. We've tried before to get parent involvement, and you know, parents are busy. Sometimes some of these kids don't have a strong support network, and so. But we think that if we're going to make meaningful change, parents have to be involved. They have to become a force in communicating with the district. And so we have a list of things that we'd like to see happen between the community and the superintendent and her staff, having periodic meetings, providing a conduit for us to communicate with those parents. So we are moving on that this coming year to see if we can create something that is going to be helpful to our kids.
And is this the outreach you've done with the Alliance of Black Educators that you're talking about?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And I know you mentioned that you've approached San Jose Unified, but are you reaching out to each district in the Santa Clara County?
Not in the beginning. Okay. At least that's not the plan right now. We're focused on a few districts. Probably, I'd say half the African American students in the county are in a handful of districts. So we're going to start there and see what we can do, and then move forward based on whatever success we have.
Okay. All right. Let's see, I went over, there are a few more comments here. Warren wanted to ask Tanya, how is the funding based on demographics? And you shared below in the chat a link to that schools with the majority of students of color statistically grossly underfunded, and you shared a link for that. Thank you, Tanya. Did you want to say anything on that, or should we just leave it with the comments?
Yeah, we can just leave. That's a much, I mean, but yeah. I think if you read the report, it kind of outlines the different areas. I mean, but that goes into, you know, even larger systemic racism, right? And how schools are funded through property taxes, so on and so forth, who are generally put into certain areas and how there's that. And so, but I think the report gives all of the information and data.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with the community here. Tiffany was talking about the individual education plans, maybe changing it to equitable education plans. I like that idea. And Roxanna shared another link, and let's see. Troubling the master narrative of grit, counter stories of Black and Latinx students with disabilities during an era of high stakes testing. Thank you. And did you want to say a little more on that? You kind of covered it though.
Yeah, all I did was just air quotes around grit, because it's, you know, we need to question this notion that students don't have grit. It's a deficit mindset to say that they need more grit.
When they're already coping
and it's blaming the students rather than addressing systemic inequities and racism, and then also high stakes tests that are designed for mass failure. That's also an issue. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and then Roxanna also added a comment to Tanya that she appreciated your attention to structural systemic racism. This is and shared with us an article. It's the latest, focusing on concerns about algorithmic bias and racism, which Roxanna talked a little bit about too. She just learned today that the Santa Clara County Office of Education is promoting the learning management system countywide. They're working on Canvas. There needs to be a greater awareness about the concerns with actions to enact stronger protections for the student data. And, you know, I think that's something that we often don't look at enough. And we've talked a little bit tonight about the fact that data is not really giving the issue, it's just giving a symptom of the issue. So, but then the reverse part of it is, can it be used against? And I think you, in conversation with me, Roxanna, are you muted? I'm sorry. You'd brought up that the problem with some of these LMS systems is they'll note to a teacher that someone's not getting their work done, and then that moves on to follows the student. So with a new teacher, they get a note saying that they haven't been very effective in doing their work, and there might have been other issues going on, and that doesn't define the student. So then they have this checkbox of they're not going to be a good student in the instant before the teachers really met them. So.
Right, and more problematic is that then those check marks that go into the analytics to try to predict the student's success later on, and it could be false check marks. It could be there's all kinds of ways that the data are not accurately, you know, collected. But then the fact that students don't know that, you know, parents don't know that these kinds of data are being used in these ways, unfortunately ends up being a weaponizing of data, and we just have to be aware of it. I will add, I'll send to you the PDF, Kristen, of the article from the EdSurge piece, the full deep dive into this learning management system that I think is worth looking into, because there are ways that if schools really want, they can negotiate contracts that are more protective of the student data. Right now, we're just sending it over. So that's just a potential solution, even though there's problems with some of the systems. I hope that clarified that it's not just the teacher in the moment or the next class. It's longer term kinds of misuses of the data.
Right. Okay. And you'd commented on that with even just the ACEs data, that just looking at that long term.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'll put one in on social emotional learning.
Thank you.
Looks like Derek has a comment.
No, I think he was signing off because he needed to go. No, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's what he wrote. Okay.
So, you know, I know that the Eastside Union High School District was looking at, they're bringing in, I want to say Los Compadres, and I was looking at them for my own district. I've been trying to figure out how to set up a healing setting on our campuses, because a lot of what we're talking about is, you know, there's not an option to get to a quiet space to have those conversations of support that you need, then you're not going to have, you're going to feel like you're just surviving the day and not given that break to take a minute and recharge your batteries. But it ties into the social emotional learning not being, they do just invite students in. It's not forced on students. And the issue I was running into with my district was it takes too long to learn this. So how do we change the conversation to don't look at the length of time, but look at the investment and the significance of an investment of that time? You know, I'm not sure how to change that conversation on engaging. You know, if their fear is it's too much of an investment of time, I mean, how is a child, how are the needs of students too much of an investment of time to be prepared to really embrace and work with them? I just don't get that response. I don't. Have you heard this before?
Yeah, well, I haven't heard that it's too long. Well, sometimes you do, because the expectation is if you're working in the school, and I'm trained as a therapist, and so if you're doing therapy, there's some places who say, you know, you got 6 weeks, particularly if you got some insurance companies or whatever. They give you so much time, and if you can't fix your problem in that amount of time, then you have to pay for it yourself.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, all issues are not resolvable within that length of time, particularly if you're talking about young people. It takes a bit of time to build that rapport with them where they actually trust you, and you can work through some of those issues. And even with that, it could be, there's some kids I'm seeing this for over a year. And unfortunately, where I am, I'm working over at Overfield, as I mentioned. I have not been pressured in any way to say, you know, you've been seeing this kid for a year, you know, you need to do something different. But I can see how in some environments where you will have that kind of pressure, because you have a lot of kids who need help, and they're trying to make sure that they see somebody, and there is that kind of pressure. And so one of the things we try to do too is we try to have group sessions. Those are good, sometimes not as effective depending on what the issue is. But as I was mentioning, schools are not really structured to give this kind of support. And so we need to figure out how do we come up with a different structure so if a kid needs that, a kid can get it either there, or we can refer them to some agency or something outside of school so they can get that support. But we all know it's better to invest and deal with it when they're young rather than letting it go and have to deal with it later.
Well, and if you're working with a kid all year long, it's really not all year unless, you know, that school happens to keep you on for the whole summertime. It's only for the school days you're there, right?
That's true, yeah.
And unfortunately, the needs of that child might not always be kept to those school days, right?
Yeah.
So there's that issue. I appreciate that there's a lot of investment and expectation of the schools to handle these situations, but it seems like there's a disconnect between, you know, if you're addressing mental health, but you're only open 180 days a year and mental health is not a 180-day a year issue, then we've got a problem, you know? Yeah. I feel like we've covered a lot of the complexities and some of the answers. I know that you talked a little bit, Leon, about needing to shore up some of the parenting skills. I mean, I like Loving Logic. Are there other parenting skill trainings that you've looked to that you feel are comprehensive and really addressing the building of that relationship and helping a child grow up in a way that they are best able to integrate into, you know, adulthood by the time they grow into that?
Well, we're looking at a program for this coming year and what it might look like. And some of it might deal with skills. A lot of it just has to do with parents having the information about what's going on in their schools and being connected enough to address those issues as a community, and feel empowered as far as being able to speak and be heard. And so, so certainly that aspect of it is important. And you know, depending on where you live here in the Valley, some parents feel more open to addressing or approaching the school board or the superintendent or whoever when they feel like their kid isn't getting what they need. And so our parents need to have that same kind of attitude. So when their kids are not performing, they are feeling that they're empowered to do that kind of thing. And then the rest of it is we're thinking at this particular point. Some of it may be with even talking about some of the history and what has been going on in our communities and how it has impacted our communities, and have parents have a dialogue about that so they better understand what they're seeing and what needs to be done to address those issues in and out of school. And so we are formulating some of those ideas right now, but we just feel like the more parents are connected and the more they are working collectively, the better.
So in part of the system, I know some of the family engagement, the district will set up a liaison to work with the parents. So are you thinking through your group, you'll develop a liaison kind of a process with this?
Well, that's what we asked for. And we also asked for that person who is the liaison to be African American.
Yes.
We think it's important for parents to see someone who looks like them if they're going to approach the district. And so, unfortunately, in some districts, they don't have a senior person on staff to play that role. And so we're trying to figure out what can we do to create that liaison type of person who has a disability at the district and parents are open to communicating with.
So Warren added that the outside, that parenting and early childhood education ages 0 through 5 is super critical. Is your group focusing mostly on the K through 12, or are you expanding that to the younger ones too?
It would be, we'll have to see, but obviously that K through 5 is an important period of time. I think a lot of what we would do moving forward will be dictated by the parents themselves and what they feel is important. But we want to have the conversation that is going to stretch across the entire school experience at least.
I'm excited that you're reaching out to San Jose Unified on this. I hope that this is a program that takes off, because I think I think of all the potential of what you're trying to do, and I think the families in our district need someone to come in and help shore up that. There's this expectation among parents that the schools know what they're doing and to trust in that. But you know, as we heard tonight, even from teachers in the district, sometimes there's a disconnect, and there are those moments that you need to speak up for your child. And if you don't know who to go to, if you don't know how to advocate for them, then there's that overwhelming sense that I can't do this. So I appreciate that you're reaching into the community to support these parents this way, because certainly it is necessary. Thank you. Let's see, there's been a few comments here. I'm sorry, Tiffany. So Tiffany added on building on the topic of counseling and support in the context of school to prison pipeline and access to additional and necessary support often provided through city funded community-based organizations. There's an opportunity based on the income gap. Yes. I agree with that. And then Circle of Security is an attachment-based program and is wonderful. Oh, Tiffany, you might get yourself on a soapbox again. And then she added a link if you wanted to learn more about Circle of Security. But I think that's something to talk about there, Tiffany. Are you able to come back on?
So I want to touch on the community-based organizations and that access to a certain level of support that's often needed and I've seen missing in our community. So let me give context about myself really quickly. Yeah. I grew up on South 22nd Street. I look extremely white. My family does not. So it's kind of interesting to be caught between that. My mom is full-blooded Sicilian and my dad's Portuguese and Italian and Puerto Rican. So they both had dark hair, dark skin, and dark eyes, and I am not. But my family, I was like the white sheep of the family. And my parents had me as teenagers and had a lot of addiction, mental health, and they were involved with criminal justice system. So that's sort of where my lens comes from. And also lots of dyslexia, no reading, and lots of family members involved. But as I started to get into this work and I went back to school because I wanted to help kids in my community and kids like me not struggle so much. So I went to Mills and I studied infant mental health, which had a focus on research psychology and the attachment system. And while there, I also was able to study Circle of Security, which is a research-based intervention program, and it's based on just really supporting the attachment between parent and child. And it was originally developed for parents who are incarcerated. So again, you can see where that was, I didn't want to get into special education necessarily. I wanted to work with incarcerated parents and help them maintain a strong attachment with their kids. Then I had kids who have learning and developmental disabilities. So I think Circle of Security is wonderful. It really looks at behaviors, communication, and teaches parents and teachers how to recognize these attachment signals, which are really saying, I need something, I need you to be bigger and stronger right now, and I need you to support me. So I think it's been the most valuable thing I've ever done with my life, because had I become a parent to the kids I have and didn't have that sort of intensive training, I don't think I could have handled it. But so the website has a lot of great information, and it's not a plug for myself, but I just think it's fabulous if you haven't heard of it. The thing about the community-based organizations that I also noticed, the other things that have really saved my family have been social thinking and access to, even though I couldn't afford Linda Mood Bell because it's super expensive, there's some targeted reading programs, and I've made friends who have utilized some of these targeted reading programs and become trainers for dyslexia. So my older son has autism or is autistic, and my younger son is dyslexic. And because of these relationships, I've got my son into social thinking, and it's been a lifesaver. And my younger son with dyslexia, I've been able to have friends who have helped me with reading intervention. And this is really lacking in our community. We see a lot of let's teach the parents, and we see a lot of focus on addiction and just controlling behavior, but not necessarily understanding behavior and giving parents and kids in the communities access to like social thinking and targeted reading. So while I love that we have tutors, Kristen was actually with me when someone from one of these reading programs approached, and I said, so what about kids with learning disabilities who like with dyslexia? And was, well, we just read with them. We don't really have that sort of training. And I think that, it's great, and I'm not trying to judge, because some kids just need someone to read a story to, but the kids that are really falling through the cracks are kids that need targeted reading instruction and intervention. And those are the sorts of programs that are only affordable and accessible by people who have the money to get it. So I think that we need to really challenge our city to invest in those sorts of high level, really effective community-based organizations that can provide those sorts of, that sort of skill set within the communities that don't have access. I don't know if that makes sense or if I was talking too quickly, but it's frustrating for me.
No, it makes sense that there's an inequity in the resources that some of our students need, or things that they need to access outside of school, and they're costly, and families can't do that, you know. And I hear that a lot with tutoring, and I loved it when some of the schools were adopting some of the social thinking into the schools, but that didn't last long. So yeah, I think that's one way to do it, is to try to bring in those resources into the school. But sadly, I think the budgets are not getting spent into the needs of a few, right? They're getting spent into the needs of the most. And when we look at our students, and if we're always teaching and designing things around the average student, well, that average student doesn't exist. What exists are really amazing individual students and individual systems like that, like the individual education plan, which isn't really a IEP plan, but would be that same acronym, you know, would be glorious because of that very reason. Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Leon?
No, I think the thing that I picked up on that is that in working with parents, is to be aware of those kind of organizations who can provide those kinds of that support, and we can be the conduit of that information. And so if we are interacting with them, or we have a site that they can visit that has information about those places, that potentially could be very valuable to a lot of parents. So that's sort of what I was walking away with that.
So Tiffany, you've worked on building some of these resources just for when you were working on your charter school, though. When you're reaching out to some of the resources that tend to be expensive, did you find that they had a sliding scale and would work with families?
Unfortunately, no. So I also serve on the Human Services Commission for the City of San Jose, and I represent disability. So right now I'm actually looking at juvenile justice involved youth with disabilities. And what the research sort of shows is, or what the research does show is, universal design approach is kind of a catch-all. If you just go in assuming that a certain number of students are going to have this need, and you plan for all, then you're not hurting anyone by implementing this universal design. You're just making sure that everyone's captured and supported, and you can communicate. So that was the basic premise of the school design that I came up with. So we're not doing the charter school. I've walked away from that effort officially, because it's a bigger mountain than I can climb on my own. And without this conversation isn't about that, but those resources, they don't have a sliding scale necessarily. And insurance doesn't cover it, and there are long waiting lists. So I think that we could be creative. I know Social Thinking, the clinical director, is also my son's therapist, and she has been fabulous. Leon, you were on the panel with her for The Kids We Lose. That was Allison King. And she does give back to the community. She spoke with San Jose Police Department, the truancy department, with me about the need to universally design the intake process, and how social communication disorders and developmental language disorders really are impacting youth in the juvenile justice system. So I know there's a willingness to partner, but they have not expanded, and I can't speak for that organization. Kristen, as you know, there's something that I like to refer to kindly as the disability industrial complex. Lots of people are making money on disability, yes, and it's unfortunate. I've never charged for anything, and I know you don't charge for your advocacy and support. I just, I couldn't bring myself to do it when these families are so already far stretched. So I think really, Leon, to answer your question, I would say collaborate with Roxanna, look at San Jose State, look at what other universities are doing in other states. I just read something that Arkansas has the best reading intervention program of all the states. I was kind of surprised. And California is not doing so well with education. So I think we need to really anchor ourselves to our local university and create more collaborations there where we have a really robust research to practice and then practice informing research. And that's both in our schools and in our communities. I think that that's what I would like to see happen. And I'd like us to really embrace this concept of universal design and equity and take that approach. I hope I answered the question.
I think you did. Warren was asking in the chat a little bit because he's not familiar with social thinking and targeted reading. Can you just expand on those a little bit so he's clear on, so the whole community is clear on what those offer?
Sure. So social thinking is this idea of social communication disorder. Lots of kids on the spectrum have social communication disorder. This specific program was developed as an intervention for kids who have average to above average intelligence. Which I have a problem with saying those sorts of things. I think that if you look at languages communication, it applies to all children. But for social thinking, it's really about understanding the theory of mind that a neurodiverse person might have and teaching flexible thinking. So it needs to be done in the moment, so that, you know, and this is an area that a lot of kids with social communication disorders are challenged with. So social thinking really talks about flexible thinking, theory of mind, and understanding how your behavior impacts the behavior of others, and, you know, how what you do can give other people sort of uncomfortable thoughts. But it's very targeted, and my son has been doing it since he was 3. And it is really, I mean, it's kind of expensive. It's, you know, we don't own a house and I don't have a nice car. And there's a lot of sacrifices, but I always say I'm lucky to have sacrifices to make. But it's expensive. And in terms of targeted reading, I would say the reading programs that focus on multimodal reading intervention, a lot of kids who have dyslexia, my son, I taught him how to read by bouncing a ball and playing like around the world with basketball and writing the alphabet on our, you know, driveway. So using movement and learning at the same time, for whatever reason, that helped his brain to make connections. And by 3rd grade, he's caught up. He's still, it's something I'm going to have to do ongoing. I think he's not quite there all the way, but he's reading at grade level. Now we're just trying to work on spelling and bigger words. But so there's things like Linda Mood Bell that does some creative things. I have never been able to afford it. There's other reading programs. The Barton and Orton Gillingham, or Roxanna, you probably know more about these. I actually never bought them. I have a friend who does it, and then I have a friend who's a speech language pathologist at San Jose State. So I've had the benefit of using their expertise and not having to pay for these expensive programs. But you know, and then there's the risk of charlatans too. So I mean, I will say that there's people who will say they'll promise the world and they're not actually doing what they should be doing. That's why I say anchor with San Jose State and make sure that it's research-based and it's targeted and effective.
Well, you know, and you've brought up another resource that just doesn't get used enough, and that's our local colleges. And you know, you've tapped into other resources, brought those to parent meetings at San Jose Unified School District, like you brought Dr. Novak in, who had a more culturally her assessment speech for SLP assessment was more culturally sensitive and more better in its diagnoses of some students. That was something to be considered, but I just didn't see anyone bite into that like I'd hoped. So you know, I think there's a lot of resources we're a resource rich county, and I'm not seeing enough of those resources get utilized by every district, which is a shame. And so one of the things I'm hoping with all of the communications between districts right now is they're beginning to hear about some of these resources and how effective they've been for other schools, and using those. So that would be good. One can hope. Let's see. So, Roxanna was noting that she was thanking you, Tiffany, for bringing this up about the disability and industrial complex. it's a good phrase.
Yeah.
There's also a nonprofit industrial complex that has been problematic in its use of philanthropic donations to privatize
philanthropic donations.
Thank you. My speech impediment comes out.
Oh, you're fine. No worries. Sorry.
These and up leading to profits for bankers in the end. The financial roots to these initiatives are troubling, given that bankers are, in parentheses, bankers, are actually profiting off of public funds, which is definitely not where it should be. Here's an op-ed in the Washington Post that she shared a link to too. Many of these initiatives focus on early learning and social emotional learning, worth paying attention to so we don't fall into these same traps. So thank you. I'll look at that too. And then Tiffany added ASD Nest, also Swift Schools and Chime Institute completely agrees with you, Roxanne. Thank you. Well, thank you. I feel like we've covered a lot, and some ideas of solutions. I was going to ask, because our district did put through a resolution about Black Lives Matter, and I invited them then to engage in letting groups then comb through their policies, because there are just in the practice of some of what's written in their policies tend to be biased. And my baby has always been the use of prone restraint. It's always used on students of color and students with disabilities. And if we're saying it's okay to use restraint that is linked to positional asphyxiation and killing people, we shouldn't be using it in our schools, period. And so I feel that if they're putting forth this resolution, this Black Lives Matter resolutions, and not really then acting on it, and I think, Tanya brought it up before, that, don't just talk the talk, but let's help our schools walk the walk. Are there other policies or systems in place that we might not grasp right away, has that bias action about it that we just need to highlight?
I think that what Tiffany brought up, that you just brought up as well, Kristen, about the prone restraint. Yes. Tiffany mentioned it while Tanya was talking, that maybe that could be a resolution that the CTA passes to prohibit that, right? And I don't know if that's been done or not, but I'm glad to connect you up with Tanya, who spoke earlier. She's a former student of mine in both the credential program and in the doctoral program at San Jose State, and she's in the leadership right now with CTA. So if that's something that might, she might learn about from you to potentially bring to the teachers union, that would be another way to.
So you're freezing up there on me. Well, Roxanna, you froze. Okay.
And understand the inequities,
yeah,
and not perpetuate them. So we're doing the work as well.
That I would love to get connected with her and talk about that and to learn, because I can't imagine that's the only one. I can't imagine it's the only policy that has those kind of issues. But until we sit down and look at them, and some policies are antiquated. So yeah. Well, we're reaching the end of the 2 hours here. I'm so sorry, because this has been a great conversation. is there anything, Leon, that you wanted to share that we didn't get to?
No, I just thank you. I appreciated the conversation myself. I learned a few things there, and I'm just pleased that we are able to do these kinds of this kind of dialogue. I think there is I guess, silver lining to this whole pandemic and our having to use technology where we are. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being available to come and do this. I know I kind of caught you within 2 weeks, which is short notice, but it's an important conversation, and you've been one of those voices on this issue and many others in our community that I really appreciate. So thank you for being on this panel. And Roxanna, thank you for joining in. I appreciate all that you've had to say and share, and all the articles you've shared here in chat that I better make sure I save before I forget.
Thank you.
And I'll be glad to share that chat with anyone that asks to get those links too. But thank you. Thank you, Tiffany, for joining in the conversation too and having so much to offer. I've really appreciated all the voices tonight at the table. Thank you.